I'll just give a quick introduction to Christopher. You can see his official bio online, and it goes on for quite a ways. The list of accomplishments is considerable, but just a couple of highlights. Christopher's an American composer, originally from New Orleans. The list of people he's worked with is incredible. It is a kind of who's who of the best ensembles and performers in the world, including, for example, the Jack Quartet, Ensemble Moderne, the New Ensemble, ASCO Ensemble, Ensemble Mosaic, the Thalia Ensemble, Argento Ensemble, Wet Ink, etc., etc., the BBC Scottish Symphony Orchestra, the American Composers Orchestra. He was the first American ever, or to win the Gaudeamus Prize, first in a very long time, and winner of the Rome Prize as well, among numerous other things, and a delightful human being as well. Great pleasure to have him here. Welcome, Christopher Trapani.
Thank you, Aaron, and thanks to the university and to the festival for having me here. It's been something like 20 years that I've been hearing about Huddersfield, the festival, the university, and CeReNeM, everything. So I'm really glad to be here and see it firsthand. I would like to, propose a really informal talk today. I do have a lot of information prepared, and I'd like to listen to one piece in its entirety, a piece that lasts about 24 minutes, and then hopefully have some room for discussion, for questions, back and forth, maybe touch on some other small pieces here and there. But you should feel free to stop me at any point, interrupt me, ask questions. Above all, let me know if you can't hear me. And last, I do have a couple of scores here, which you're welcome to take a look at, pass around. I'll just leave them here in case anyone wants a glance. The first one is Convergence Lines, the piece that I'm going to speak about most today. And the second is a piece called Polychrome, which is being played tomorrow night by Ensemble Moderne. So, Convergence Lines. This was a big project of about 5 years ago. Piece for 10 instruments and live electronics. And it was commissioned from the Ensemble Orchestre Contemporain in Lyon. Not insignificant, because at this point in my life I was writing pieces always influenced by the shapes of the cities where they were commissioned, and the sort of V shape of Lyon leading down to a convergence point at the south was a central idea behind this piece. And also, not coincidentally, the Thomas Pynchon novel, V. Much of my work is influenced by literature. I did a degree in English as an undergraduate, and I spent a lot of time thinking about how to translate literary forms into music. And this is a piece I like to talk about because it gives me a chance to talk about the literary angle, but also a highly technical thought process that went into this piece. Also, when I work with electronics, I like to think that I approach it from a poetic angle rather than a technical angle. So we marry the two in this presentation. Some of you may be familiar with the novel. It's basically a novel in two separate strands. There are two narratives that are interwoven. The first is a relatively straightforward narrative that takes place in New York City in the 1950s. Follows a group of sort of lost youths in the 1950s, and the piece throughout makes reference to the music of this time, just the same way that the novel does. A lot of the scenes take place in a jazz club that's clearly influenced by Thelonious Monk and Ornette Coleman and Charlie Parker, and also some references to sort of the late big band era and the burgeoning salsa movement. You'll hear those throughout the piece. So that's one side, and in Pynchon's book, it's not as clearly delineated as my extrapolated form. I simply alternate movements, moving back and forth between the two narrative strands. And the second strand does not have any sort of linear continuity to it. Everything unfolds in different places, and it jumps around in time, starting with Cairo in the late 19th century, Florence at the turn of the century, Southwest Africa, German protectorate, Valletta, Malta, Paris around the First World War. And the novel ends in another sort of V-shaped city of Valletta in Malta. So let me talk now a bit about the electronics. The main tool that I use is something called CAD-ART, which does concatenative synthesis in real time. That's what that stands for. And basically, the concept is that you load in a sound or a series of sounds, and it separates them into any number of small grains. And you can visualize these grains on a 2D screen. I hope this is familiar to some of you, but just in case. Basically, you can trace a trajectory through this two-dimensional screen and play back the sounds, but in a sort of intelligent, reorganized way. So, for instance, in this version, I've charted loudness on the y-axis. So if you start at the bottom, move to the top, everything gets louder as you go. And this is a tool that was very popular amongst improvisers. It was also used to make sort of collage pieces very frequently. But I always found it limited for working with pitch, and pitch is a crucial component of my music. So starting back about 5 years ago, I implemented something called targeted transposition with CAD-ART. And this is a project undertaken with former Huddersfield postdoc Aaron Einbond. Aaron and I are old colleagues, and we implemented this together. And the basic principle is when you navigate in this 2D space, the grains of sound are selected, but in between, in the split second before they're selected and played back, you look up the pitch content of a sound, and then you can transpose it to a field of predetermined pitches. I should say I use it to do this exactly, transpose in the domain of pitch, but you could use it for any domain. You could use it to normalize sounds and give them all the same loudness. You could use it to filter sounds and give them all the same brightness. I'm going to show a little video here because this will make it clearer exactly what's going on. So here you could select different sounds from amongst the ones that are preloaded. And also give different envelopes and durations. And so here are a few musical examples. Two modules simultaneously now. So I use it to make a sort of slow transition from one sonority to another, but keeping the harmony constant, or also with a slow evolution in the harmony at the same time. The first pieces that I did, this actually uses that same set of sounds, were done in collaboration with video artists, a duo from Madrid called Things Happen. And basically, we used the selection information. So every time a sound was played, a bang could be sent, or a signal could be sent to another computer, and the visual artist took that information and translated it into some kind of response in the image. So here, for example, these triangles flashing on with each sample. It's actually a bridge between two different movements of the piece. First one with piano, second one with violin, so now you know why those sounds are interpolated. Here's another short excerpt from the same piece. In this one I've taken some multiphonic sounds on the oboe and the baritone sax, and those pitches have been analyzed and redistributed to the cat functions. So at this point, I had written just this one piece, and I wanted to do a larger ensemble piece with some of these same tools. And this is an excerpt from Convergence Lines. This will show you a little bit of the electronics. There are a couple of different ways to interact with these CAD art modules, and the first one is just by sort of describing a very general trajectory and letting it run. And in this case, I limited it to some drum sounds. It will just there are a couple small changes of timbre that integrated, but more or less it's just perpetually generating sounds from these samples. Another possibility is to interact with one of the live instruments. So in this case, there's a trombone on stage that plays this slowly evolving passage with harmon mute. And what I do with CAD art is I follow not only the energy, but also the spectral centroid, these two parameters here, so the brightness of that sound, and the samples that are selected in response somehow correspond to that level of brightness and give a sort of halo to that A flat. First, here's the trombone sound itself, I think. Some other instruments in the background. And here it is with the harmony that I'm imposing. Another version. Just so you can hear that the selection is happening live. It's not exactly the same every time. Are there any questions so far? I realize this is all a little vague until we actually hear the piece, but bear with me and I'll show you a few more examples. In preparing this piece, like I said, everything that's done in CAD is from a base of samples that's prepared in advance, a corpus, a bank of samples. So I wanted to add to this, and I recorded several of the musicians of the ensemble in Lyon. First of all, the brass players, often playing with these antique dance era mutes, like the Buzzwow mute. I don't know if anyone's familiar with this, but this is a trombone mute which has 3 kazoo membranes built into the front of it. It has a very raspy sound. Also some prepared harp samples. In this one there are these closed pins and also some bits of aluminum foil on the bottom of the harp that give it a sort of metallic timbre. This particular one's very consonant. And I would take these samples and not only use them in the playback, but also composing the piece, analyze them like this. And once I had the pitch content, I could copy and paste it into my CAD art patch and generate a sort of a colored orchestration that flows out of the resonance of these samples. So here's an example. A little delicate. You can also see that the output is in 6 channels, and here I've just condensed everything into 2. So this is one side of the electronics of Convergence Lines. The other is Intoscope, the score follower. And this is a bit of software that was developed at IRCAM that basically allows the computer to follow a score. So the computer needs the information about a particular, usually a monophonic line. Here's an example where in the third movement I have the computer following the trumpet, and I've written in here in the Intoscope language the text, a text version of the score basically. It starts with a trill on E5, which is how the machine best recognizes a flutter tongue note, and progresses from there. So there are grace notes given a duration of 0. What's really fantastic about working with Intoscope is, as you probably know, most of the time when you're working with electronics, everything has to be timed absolutely. Everything has to be done in milliseconds. And this gives you the possibility of working in actual musical language, rhythmic notation, and the machine, as it listens, constantly recalculates the tempo and knows where it is in the score. So when you get to a certain note, it triggers an event, and there's a response in the electronics. I'm going to show you an example in a little bit that'll make this clearer. But basically, the machine listening aspect, the score follower, is turned on and off throughout the entire piece. It functions mainly in the odd-numbered episodes, which I should say in advance so you can sort of keep track as you listen. Those are the episodes. They tend to be, these are the New York 1950s episodes. They tend to be busier. They feature the brass. They have a lot of rhythmic energy compared to some of the others. So basically there are 4 different instruments that are listened to at different points, and we open the microphone and close it accordingly throughout the length of the piece. This allowed me to do a couple of interesting rhythmic experiments. This one I'll just try to explain really quickly. In the first movement, there's a bit where the onstage brass is being echoed, sort of antiphonal responses coming from cat art, and I was able to sort of have these nearly irrational durations by interpolating a second layer of rhythms between a notated layer of rhythms. And the way it works is if you just look at these durations here, you take every one of them and you divide it by 2 and place an attack exactly at the midpoint of each of these durations. Or you could divide it by 2 or 3 or add a third layer to this. And so there's a sense of subdivision, there's a sense of proportion and equality, but it's also quite unpredictable in the advancement of it. So this is a patch in Open Music that I used to calculate, basically to generate the text information that I would then put inside the Intoscope score. And that's what this is, again, using a visual interface that was designed. Basically the visual interface is just reading the note information over here. It's another version of a score. This one deduced from a text file. And underneath it are the various cues that are going to the electronics. So here's an actual passage from the score, and you can see what the brass are playing, a sort of quick chorale with a lot of hits. And this line with the electronics, well, it doesn't give you much information, but it tells you more or less where the attacks are supposed to align. And I'll let you hear it. It's a little chaotic sounding. Allows me to build layers of rhythmic antiphony. Okay, last example I'll show before we listen to the piece. I want to zoom in on the 7th movement. The 7th movement is a sort of piano solo. It's basically the pianist is foregrounded, and I try to combine 2 different influences here. One of them is Thelonious Monk, who is mentioned throughout the novel, and maybe if you know some Thelonious Monk, you've heard one of his typical gestures starting a piece like this. And the second influence that I kind of try to marry with Thelonious Monk here is some Mancaro, of course, and that's kind of the result. What I've done is I actually went on the web and looked for some Monk transcriptions, some MIDI files, and imported those up here, and using the sort of gestalt, which is really simple downward motion, I would reverse them or stretch them and create my own versions of these downward falls and resynthesize them using samples over here. So sometimes with just straightforward piano sounds, sometimes with prepared piano sounds. There's some with paper, and you can see up on the right-hand corner all the different libraries that I have. And finally, I'm combining them into a 6-channel sound file and giving over here a sort of trajectory to the sound, so you can hear it moving in space too, which of course is a component that you're missing here. And I applied this not only to the downward scale, but to a couple of other monk typical gestures, like some jagged stride rhythms, or the sort of inner voices that move down in semitones. So what I want to do now is play for you, so I can, okay, yeah, before starting this, you can see, I'll show you the entire 7th movement, and the score advances on the left. This is the ASCO graph representation of the text format score that the score follower is listening to in real time. And then up here, this is the actual listener. So you'll see throughout the movement that it's recalculating the tempo, where it says BPM, real-time tempo. You'll see the pitches that it recognizes as it goes, and you'll see that more or less, well, you'll see it being turned on and off, because there are some interjections, some passages from some other instruments. Particularly, for some reason in the novel, there's a reference to a natural horn player who plays jazz, and so there's a bit of natural horn. And yeah, I'll just let you listen to it, I think, and you'll hear how the electronics events, which are on that staff there, are triggered as the piece goes by the piano. And the movement has a form that's kind of borrowed from Nankaro, where the live and electronic voices just converge more gradually, which again is the shape of the entire piece. So here it goes, it's about 2 minutes. So that's it for the long introduction. I'll play the piece now, and there is one score going around if anybody wants to follow it. Not that one, but there. Otherwise, I will project the score up here. while we listen.